Hello and welcome to Conversations with Catholics. I am Kevin Non-Tradicath, and I'm very honored today to be joined by Thomas Polega. Thomas, what's going on? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi there, everybody. So my name's Thomas Polega. So I'm a practicing cradle Catholic, and I've gone, a long journey in the church. I was raised by a very conservative Catholic family, not a traditionalist one. That's something that I actually did myself later in life. After I got out of high school, I became a trad. Primarily because, like, I saw, even though I had gone to Catholic elementary, middle school, high school, that the whole Risorgimento, Catholic world just wasn't transforming people, right? And so I wanted to go and see, like, okay, this, if people aren't being transformed, and what for me, what transformed is like distinguishable between secular people, right? I'm like, well, what's the point of the religion if you just end up like everybody else? So that's what drew me to traditionalism, as well as, the really serious focus on doctrine. And I went through that phase for about 2 years or so. I never got as deep as some people got, but like there was a solid year in there where like I was very strict and only went to Latin mass. Like I was, Novus Ordo, as part of the Masonic, liturgy and all that good stuff. So yeah, I was really strict, and then I kind of, slowly backed out because I don't think I ever like. There was a moment I'm like, I'm not trad, right? It was a slow process where it's just like, you know what, this just gets more ridiculous. And a big influence for me was that during that time, I was going to Franciscan University of Steubenville. Um, and you know, during that time, I got to experience, a very traddy community, as well as being in.
Whoop. Thomas, you froze a little bit. Once you're back, I'll let you know where you left off. In the meantime, hey Anton, glad you're able to tune in as much as you can. And thanks for setting this up, Anton. So we owe this conversation to you. Also, what's up, Daniel? Um, I think that you two in particular are gonna like this conversation because part of this conversation is going to be, um, I think, about perhaps a way that Catholics can view things like contraception as not uncatholic, shall we say. Hey, he's back. What's up, Thomas?
Hi, sorry there, everybody. I believe I was talking about being at Fran-
Franciscan. Yeah.
yeah. And a lot of what I kind of backed off from the trad thing was really my experience with Eastern Catholics and the Orthodox, where, especially that kind of like rigidity of like, the Latin, mass and the Roman rite is somehow unique and special, really kind of broke down a lot for me, just kind of on a experiential level. But really, probably more than that was Franciscan. The whole idea is to try to make a radical Catholic society. The university is the largest, conservative Catholic university in the United States. And 98% of the population identifies as Catholic. And so I'm like, if we're going to figure out how to do Catholicism right, like this is where it's going to happen. And just my experience of living in that community was just wow, this is a giant mess. And
I'm sorry.
it
I
just
shouldn't
is,
laugh.
right? Yeah, but it no, it's good because like that's kind of actually the appropriate response when you walk away. It just kind of giggles, like for real. You know, I mean, it was a good trick. It was a good try, but like when life happens, you're like, wow, I can't take that super seriously anymore. And it certainly is not a standard to build my soul and convict other people on. Right. And that's really important because, like, that's really kind of like if you're a really true believer, like, that's where you want to be going is making that claim. So that's what was happening there. And I was kind of went back to being more of a normal conservative Catholic for a long time. And eventually, though, primarily my experiences of just being a missionary over in Tanzania for a year, as well as being part of the institutional church as a youth minister, as well as working for the church, and then my experiences in the military. Eventually, all just kind of moved me away where just kind of abandoned, those pieces of kind of conservative Catholicism one by one until now, like I'm very progressive. And of course, anybody who knows me knows that I'm not trying to, it's not a secret. Um, yeah, no, it's really not. There's a lot of strangers out there that know me, and they know me as, uh, you know, uh, let's just say, I have more bad, hateful comments than I care to, go over. But I've been called, satanic, and demonic, speaker of the devil, a sheep's and wolves or a wolf in sheep's clothing. Despicable, gay, faggot, it just goes on and on. I have hundreds of those comments because I think what I'm saying, you know, people get that, like, you know what, the traditional movement isn't just, well, we're got the truth, and then those people out there, they just don't understand, right? And that's a lot, that's a big power that they have, is that, like, well, when you engage with secular or even just kind of like more normal Catholics, like, they're not quoting encyclicals, they're not bringing up, statements from the councils or canon law. A lot of people are extraordinarily ignorant on the traditions of the Catholic Church. And so it's very easy to dismiss those people and push them out of the way of just like, well, those are sort of the heathen non-believers. So, it doesn't really bother us. But I think when people really understand what they're talking about and know where they come from and can actually speak on their same language, the reality is people have to take a step back and they have to either, say, hey, let me listen, or you got to push back really hard. So that's a little bit of an introduction about myself. I probably some other important facts about myself. I'm the oldest of 8 kids.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was in my just experience of growing up. I was homeschooled for about 4 years when I was in elementary school, which had a big impact on me. And now, of course, anybody who already doesn't know me, I got a big Twitter page and account, and I'm pretty notorious on there, for good and for ill. Uh, Personally, right now, I'm taking a little bit of a break, kind of holding off some of it, just because.
All right. When Thomas comes back, I'll make sure that we get his notes on when he was or why he's taking a break from Twitter. In the meantime, though, it is a Franciscan reunion today, which I kind of find funny. So between Daniel and Rosemary, and of course Thomas, we do have a Franciscan reunion. Of course, I don't know if you three are the types of people that most people think of when they think of Franciscan, but it's a Franciscan reunion nonetheless. Yeah, demonic, satanic, and other insults and demagoguery really defeat attempts at dialogue. Yeah, well said. That's absolutely true. Um, it's oh, and he's back.
Hi there. So, I opened up the door in the back. I am doing connection through Wi-Fi, so maybe that might help with our connection issues a little
Cool.
bit.
Cool.
Real quick, I didn't quite see where I got cut off.
Yes. So you were talking about you're famous on Catholic Twitter. You didn't say that, but I'm saying that. And you said that you were taking a break from Catholic Twitter because
Yeah. Yeah, because I've said a lot of what I can say on Twitter, and honestly, Twitter's a dumpster fire.
yeah.
And it's worse every day. And it's not just Elon's fault. It's the American culture is collapsing. Our society is fracturing apart. And the same thing inside the church. The church at this particular situation, it's really vile and ugly. Um, And I think that I want to be able to move to place where we can have like a much more serious, articulate, like long form to really think about some of these issues, not just make comments and statements and make snippy kind of things to get attention, which are great and there's a purpose for that. But I feel like I've kind of done most of what I want to do in that regard. So I'm going to try out, just being a little more serious and thoughtful.
Hey, I like that, and I haven't really been on Twitter since 2016 or something like that, because of the exact reasons that you just outlined there. So I am right there with you when you refer to Twitter as like toxic and stuff like that. That's why I'm not there. Um,
Yeah, and and I wish it wasn't, but that's just kind of the situation we're at.
it's the
But
nature.
I want to like,
It's the nature
yeah,
of the short form. Like the tweet is only however many characters or whatever. It's just you can't have a real conversation that way.
it's also part of the community, right? Because
Yeah.
Medium has an impact, but community also has an impact, and yeah, but I'd
Real
like to kind of transition into our like specific talk on
Real
contract.
quick, if you don't mind,
Yeah,
couple just questions. So
yeah.
we have a few Franciscan grads in the live chat who want to know what years you were at Franciscan, because we have a little bit of a Franciscan reunion going on right now.
Oh dear. So I was there for years 2012 through 2016.
Okay, 2012 to 2016. And let me see, where's the comment where Rosemary and Daniel are both Franciscan grads, and Anton is saying that two of his
Hello,
other.
fellow Frankies.
Yep. So you guys are numerous. It seems like. So what's up to everybody who is a Franciscan grad and everybody who's not a Franciscan grad. Just wanted to say hi to everybody before we jump into today's topic. But and I do see that Anthony's asking about original sin. We might get there, Anthony. It is in the title. It
Maybe.
is.
Maybe.
But we're gonna try to do contraception first, and
Yeah.
if it takes the whole conversation, then it takes the whole conversation. And if we don't get to original sin, well, then there's always next time. So
Yeah. If you want a quick answer to the original sin thing, original sin, as Thomas Aquinas says, comes through the testes, which isn't correct, by the way, but it's actually very close to being correct. And my proposition about original sin really centers around the creation of the state. And because this is, I think, is how we have to really understand, like, where does original sin really come from? Where our obligations come from? How does that combine with evolution and the, our understanding of the natural origin of man? And most importantly, our own experience, right? Like, so that's the quick answer. But unfortunately, we're going to have to wait for the rest of it.
no worries, no worries. So just to tee up today's discussion, the way that you and I were kind of introduced to each other was through our mutual friend Anton. And Anton told me, he said, you would be really
Yeah,
interested in talking to Thomas. He has a lot of really interesting hot takes, one of which is on contraception.
of
So
course.
that's the topic that we're going to start with today. And we might dwell on contraception the whole time. But with that, Thomas, you're a Catholic, and Catholicism
Yes.
traditionally has all these rules about contraception. But anybody who's read your Twitter knows that your takes on contraception are a little bit different than what might people have considered the traditional Catholic approach to contraception. So
Yep.
what is all of that about? What is, I guess, the traditional view, and why do you disagree with it?
Yeah. So I'm going to bring up my notes here
Yep.
because I want to read something that's really important. All right. So we're going to have a discussion on this issue. And I would just like to very humbly say that of everything that I have to say, I don't think anything is more important than what our blessed John Paul the First, not the second, but the first, who is in heaven right now looking over us, what he had to say on this issue, right? And I want to be able to start that. So let's hear what Blessed John Paul the First has to say on contraception. It would seem not to go against nature if manufactured in imitation of natural progesterone. One would use it to distance birth from the other, to give rest to the mother, and to think of the good of children already born or to be born. For me, this is the biggest theological issue that has ever been dealt with in the church. When there was Arius or Nestorius, they were talking about the two natures in Christ. They were very serious issues, yes, but they were understood only by the top of the church, by theologians and bishops. The poor people understood nothing about these things and would say, I adore Jesus Christ. I love the Lord who redeemed me. This, a problem that is no longer concerns the top leadership of the church, but the whole church, all young families. Of course, for the lawfulness of its use, the circumstances must concur. Righteous intention, that is the intention of bringing into the world, over the years of fecundity, the number of children that can be appropriately supported and educated. That's Blessed John Paul I. That's after the coming out of Humanae Vitae. And unfortunately, Blessed John I was only Pope for 1 year. Or not 1 year, 1 month. Not even a year, 33 days to be precise. Where he was almost certainly murdered. Now, of course, that's not the official position, but I think if you took the case before a jury, it would be very clearly indicated that he was almost certainly murdered. And the reasons for that were well known, and that is his desire to change the teaching on contraception, as well as to root out financial corruption inside of the Vatican. He is the Pope that we should have had, but for whatever reason, the Lord took him away and gave us John Paul II. You know, the way I have always seen this is a great deal of the problems that we have in the church. When people think about what is the church or not the church, they're not actually thinking of the church. They're thinking of John Paul II. This is where the encroachment of infallibility has run rampant, which is consuming the Catholic Church, as well as these seeming unmovable positions, and even just the ending of conversation around church teaching and church tradition, and a systematic rejection of modernity and the Enlightenment, and really the people of the church, right? And so much so that even when we speak of today, when we say church, what we actually mean are the bishops. And that itself is a problem. That's a corruption of our thinking way of the church, is that it doesn't include people sitting in the pew. It includes an tiny aristocratic monarchical system that takes on the identity of the whole church. And this actually gets to the second quote that I want to go through, and that is from Cardinal Martini, which people may not be aware of who Cardinal Martini is. Cardinal Martini was the second runner-up to become the Pope instead of Benedict. So in 2005, Cardinal Martini almost became Pope. That's not that long ago. And Cardinal Martini made the famous quote that said that the church is behind the times by 200 years. Now that 200 is not just a random number. It's a very specific number. It's in direct reference to the ending of the ancient regime, that is the French monarchy and the whole system of absolute monarchy, and the subsequent French Revolution. The reality is that's when the Enlightenment came to a point where it had systematic structural change of society and was fully accepted. The church has never accepted that. We still live in a pre-Enlightenment age, even down to that identity of like, who is the church, right? The idea that the people who are Catholic are the church, and that obscuring that the hierarchy is the church, this is a direct pullover from the absolutist monarchical regime where the monarch and his immediate, governors, they are the sovereign, right? They are France. In fact, it's that famous quote from Louis the 14th, right? Is like, "I am the state,"
Hmm.
and that's really where we are today in the Catholic Church, where the popes say that I am the church, right? And that transformation has not happened yet. And this is something that where we also get into that whole issue of where there's been a systematic process of silencing voices on speaking about the Catholic Church, um, and also a systematic establishing of ignorance over the laity in order to maintain the legitimacy and control of the hierarchy. The reality is that most people that we're going to hear of what I'm going to talk about, they've either never heard or it sounds so fantastical that it's going to sound like I made these up. And there's a reason for that. And that is because we still live in a society, right, that is built on the ignorance of the laity. We have had some reforms, just like the absolute monarchy, right? They ended slavery, right, and established serfdomship. It allowed for the universities to begin having discussions, right? But there's, at the end of the day, right, there's still a stranglehold on what Catholics are allowed to hear. If you are a priest, what it is you can talk about. If you're a catechetics teacher, whether or not you're going to be able to keep your position, depending on what you have to say. So let's get down into some of the breakdowns of this issue on contraception. The first question, which is the really big question, and I'm not going to spend too much time on here because we're gonna break this down some more. But the first question is like, is the teaching on contraception or what is it, right? And the teaching of the church is that every single act must not preclude the dual ends of sex. That is unity and procreation. And the church has been very clear in Humanae Vitae as well as in the Catechism that this precludes the possibility of using any form of artificial contraception, and that includes, like the pull-out method or such types of forms. The only thing that has been allowed for Catholics to space birth is through natural family planning. Now the question is this teaching what authority is this teaching? And this is, like I said, we're gonna move past this a little bit. I'm gonna get back to it, but the question is like, well, is the church teaching on contraception infallible? And the answer is no. And not only that, but like every single pope has confirmed that it is not infallible, starting with Paul VI and everyone since. So this isn't some like super controversial perspective, and we're going to talk about like why that is. And the second thing is that if it's not infallible, what kind of teaching is that? And the reality is that the teaching on contraception is an authoritative teaching of the church, which does not require, as outlined by Vatican II, does not require the assent of faith. Rather, it requires what we call religious assent. Now, religious assent and assent of faith are important distinctions in Catholic doctrine, as religious assent means that you need to take the teachings of the Catholic Church as promulgated authoritatively and universally extremely seriously, and you need to not just merely dismiss them, but you need to take a serious inquire with your own conscience, and that's through our own lived experiences, the experiences of others, as well as theological examination of these positions. But if a Catholic then does these things and tries to live out those teachings of the church, right? So it's not just something that we can just merely dismiss. We do need to attempt to live out the teachings that the church outlines, even if they're not infallible. But primary of conscience always trumps all of these things when it's well informed. And that's what that process is. You need to inform your conscience well. And if your conscience is informed well, not only Catholics can disagree with non-infallible teachings of the Catholic Church, but they're morally obligated to follow their conscience, right? And this is really important. And this is something that we don't talk about a lot, but it's very clearly set out in Vatican II as well as in the Catechism. The other question is then, we're going to address of like, should the teaching of the church change? I'm going to make a strong argument that the church should change its teaching on this. And we're going to go over like why. So let's go over first when it came to the infallibility question. I said that every pope has affirmed this. So what are those affirmations, right? So let's start with Paul VI. Paul VI affirmed that Humanae Vitae was not infallible. And he did this immediately after the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, as specifically asked to the presenter, Archbishop Lamborghini. I apologize if I mispronounce it. I don't speak Italian. So forgive me, Your Excellency. But he was very specifically asked this question. This is the hand-picked representative to explain the encyclical by Paul VI, and he explicitly said that it is not infallible. Then we have John Paul I, right? And as we already spoke, the quote there, that is him outlining the fact that he doesn't believe that it's infallible and that he actually looks forward to a liberalizing of the teaching. Now let's get to John Paul II. So John Paul II really wanted to be able to make a extraordinary, that is an ex cathedra definition and statement on the church teaching of contraception. First off, the fact that he wanted to do this is a confirmation that he understood that this is not an extraordinarily infallibly defined teaching. It was then Ratzinger, future Pope Benedict, who persuaded him not to make this statement, right? So we now have Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, and Benedict all confirming that the teaching on contraception is not infallible. And then we have Pope Francis has explicitly confirmed that the teaching of contraception is not infallible. This is very clearly outlaid in his Canadian interview. That is the interview in the plane when he was leaving Canada, where he was specifically asked on the question of contraception and whether or not the church could or would change the teaching. And he outlined that the church is always developing and that it's wrong to do theology with a no in front of it. That's where that quote comes from. And he specifically praised the work of the Pontifical Academy of Life, which, for those who might not know what that is, that's basically the Pope's private think tank. And they have published a work calling for the change on the teaching of contraception. So we now have that every single pope has affirmed that the teaching of the Catholic Church with the issue of contraception isn't infallible. We're also going to go through, there's conditions. Some people will like to try to say, well, maybe there's not an extraordinary definition, which is important because if it's not extraordinarily defined, it's not universally and absolutely binding on all conscience. That requires the assent of faith, right? And some people will try to bring up this question, right? Like, is it defined by the ordinary, infallible teaching of the church? And one of those requirements, as again outlined by Vatican II, is that the Pope has to speak in total communion with all of the popes or all the bishops. My bad. We only got one Pope, folks.
Right now, well, a couple hundred years ago, we had three at once. So
I was gonna say, if we do, it's bad. So it happens. It happens. But it's bad. You're only supposed to have one. But when Humanae Vitae came out in 1968, 2 months later, which, by the way, like, I'm Catholic. you're ex-Catholic, you know that like the Catholic takes 1,000 years to do anything,
Yes,
right?
nothing happens quickly in the Catholic Church.
But this is an important exception, and I think it just like clarifies how serious this is that 2 months after the promulgation of Humanae Vitae, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops issued their Winnipeg Statement. The Winnipeg Statement explicitly and in very clear language rejects the teaching of Humanae Vitae. This means that not all the bishops have assented to this teaching. And still to this day, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops have not rescinded that document. In fact, they've had a vote on it to remove it, and it was not accepted. So that statement is still true. Not all the bishops of the world agree with Humanae Vitae. Uh, Now, we're going to go into some questions, and I think, you know, this I think is obviously more than proof enough of the question of like, whether or not, it's infallible and can change. But I found that some of this stuff is just so hard for people, right? And you're like, okay, well, maybe Thomas, like, that's a bunch of documents and stuff, but but the church has never done this. So like, how can you say this? Like, this seems very speculative and like, maybe not. Like, I'm just not really buying it, even if maybe I kind of follow your logic. But like, the church has never done this. So like, why should we even take this seriously? So let's go over the question of authoritative, teachings in the Catholic Church. Like, have they changed? Right? And like, how is the framework in which that transformation happens, and what do those look like? So I think for me, and just kind of my conception of the church in regard to morals, I really see that there are primary four key phase transitions that the church has gone through in its radical redefining and transformation of its idea of morality and what it teaches. So the first is pacifism. So for the first couple of centuries, the vast majority of Catholics, now there was no official promulgation on this issue, but there was also almost no official promulgation on anything because, Christians were very brutally persecuted and were an underground church during the Roman Empire during this period. But the common belief, which is important, that's not the same thing as official teaching, but the common belief of most Christians was that all war is intrinsically wrong. And not only is it intrinsically wrong, but that it is wrong for any Catholic to be able to go into the military. This was a big sticking point. It's actually why even after the empire converted, almost all of the Catholics who were in the military were still Arians. A lot of this had to go from, again, trying to move and push away from this idea that Catholics can't conduct war in self-defense. However, once the empire was converted through pressure from Constantine, as well as the bishops themselves, and I think more importantly, that transition of where now Catholics had an obligation, not just as individuals, right, to a moral life, but had an obligation to how to run the state, is that it became unambiguously clear that war wasn't just something that was a tolerable evil, but a moral obligation of Catholics. And this is a big shift. And that shift happens because of a change in our experiences and the condition of the Catholic people. The next component that we're going to go into is a long transitional period where, starting with the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea strictly defined and defined and made unlawful for priests not to conduct usury. Now, it's important because in the Council of Nicaea, it explains what usury is, and that's the charging of any interest on a loan, right? It's very important. I know a lot of people will talk about, saying that usury is still wrong, which according to the Catholic Church, it is. but the definition of what usury is has changed. And it started with the Council of Nicaea, where it included no interest rate. However, this only applied to priests. It's not until the Third Lateran Council during the 12th century that the church very importantly changed this prohibition against usury to all Catholics, including lay persons. And this is in the canons of the Third Lateran Council. It also included an excommunication for all notorious usurers. Then in the beginning of the 14th century, during the Council of Vienna, they extended and doubled down on this teaching, where they said that if anyone were to say that usury was a sin, that they should be treated as if they're a heretic. So these are really extreme, increasing levels of teaching, but none of these ever extend to the point of infallibility. These aren't universal, and even in the Nicaea, how they even define it, it's very interesting. They almost do it as a joke, where they say it's like 1/100th of a percent. And this is a common colloquialism to basically say, well, really nothing, right? But these are the authoritative teachings of the church. And it's not all the way up until 1830 through 1871, through a series of letters promulgated by the church, that the church finally officially changes its teaching on usury and allows for the charging of interest up to all situations. Actually, each of those letters, their situations, it allows usury for this situation and this situation until finally up until 1871. Now the charging of interest is no longer considered by the Catholic Church to be intrinsically wrong. Now this has quite some time, and of course anyone knows this today, right? If the church still held to its teaching from Lateran III, right, having a bank account would be against Catholic teaching, because you get interest payments on your bank account, right? And not only this, but like all of society couldn't function.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
Like this isn't like, well, it's bad that, the gays can't get married. And so like, we're just going to put this small number of people and we're going to oppress them, and, which is fine because everyone else will be fine. Right? And like, that's a horrible argument. But like, people make that argument, and you almost can kind of like get there if you're in that mindset. But the question around usury isn't like that. The question is like, can all of civilization exist, right? Or not, right? Like that's the, and really what spurred this on was what really exploded in the Transformation. There was lots of theoretical thinking about this during the Middle Ages, of when or why or if usury, might not mean, right, that no forms of interest were allowed, but like actually under certain circumstances maybe it would be, acceptable. There was theories of like the time and like difficulty of like loaning, right? That like, hey, like when I loan you money and I get interest, that's not really me profiteering necessarily, because like I have to take on risk that maybe you might not pay. I have administrative costs, things like this, where we can kind of like think about this. So there were lots of theories about this in the Middle Ages, but it really was the discovery of the New World that just shattered, the conscience of, the Catholic people. Because when the Spaniards discovered the New World, they discovered a lot of gold. And I mean, a lot of gold, which is motivated for a lot of sinful behavior that happened over there. But when there's that much at stake, right, people can become very unscrupulous. And obviously that's a whole nother discussion that we're not going to talk about. What it does apply to this question is that this influx of gold into Europe caused unimaginable degrees of inflation, right? Something that Europeans had just really never experienced before. Um, you know, the inflation rate, was well like into the hundreds of percentages, and it caused absolute economic like mayhem and collapse and like anarchy inside of Europe, especially because like since it was from the medieval system, we had lots of contracts that were denoted in like set monetary values, right? So rent might be, one, I don't know what the, but like one, 1/16 of an ounce of gold is the rent for this property in perpetuity, right? Well, that's fine if for like 200, 300 years you have effectively no inflation. But then if say, now you suddenly have 300% inflation over, a decade or two, right? Uh, if you own that property and those rents, I mean, those things disappear. I mean, it's just crazy. The chaos was just really just breaking people, and this is us realizes that money is not just something that is a store of value that like actually the owning and management and loaning of money has a value uh, that's beyond just transfer of goods and services. And this that experience with this transformation is what really convicted the conscience of Catholics that like what like maybe the church teaching isn't right, like maybe we need to re-examine this because like we as human beings we just didn't get this, right? And you can imagine that like in a society that has essentially zero economic growth, that charging interest could really be seen as like just pure predatorialness, right? Because there's no way for you to be able to pay that back without just a infinite transfer of wealth from people who have money to people who don't. Um, but if the economy is growing or the money supply is growing, right, this isn't necessarily true, right? Because like I can pay back an interest on those loans, but since there's economic growth, well, now that money has more goods to buy, or if there's inflation, right, the value of that money changes over time. Um, and I bring up this issue, and I kind of get stuck on this issue for a little bit, because this is the best analogy of to what I believe is happening around sexual ethics and specifically the issue around contraception. It was understandable of why medieval church, and by the way, this wasn't just Catholics, right? Islam, still tries to hold to a certain version of this. It depends on obviously which Muslims you talk to. Some of them are just like, yeah, whatever, bleh. And I'm not an Islamic, theologian, so I don't know all of the examples. I just know in practice, right? There's lots of loopholes where effectively they ignore it. But like for example, if you're like ISIS, you take this stuff really seriously. No interest payments on loans, right? Like they're very serious about this stuff. But of course, like I mean, who wants to live in ISIS's medieval fantasy world? I mean,
My
obviously some people do.
understanding, yeah, my
Yeah,
understanding of
go
how
ahead.
Muslims work with their laws on usury is that they write contracts that essentially say, "Hey, I'm lending you a whole bunch of money at once, and if you don't pay it back all at once, then you owe me this much extra per month." And they
Yeah,
just don't use the word interest, and then it's okay.
yeah.
Which, like, well,
So,
that is
so my
interest.
yeah, so my dad and my family they lived in Saudi Arabia for 7 years.
Okay.
So yeah, there's all kinds of schemes of where like you can make the like you can follow the letter of the law and just like totally bypass
Yeah.
anything. Which by the way, this is what Catholics did during after the discovery of the New World, right? There was lots of schemes of how to get around the usury laws. In fact, Florence, right, and the Renaissance, the creation and renewal of Europe was entirely financed on usury money, all of it. Florence was built. Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's Basilica was financed through the money made through usury. Um, and the whole transformation of Europe, because you have to be able to loan and get interest on money in order to have economic development. It just, you want to build stuff, you want to make stuff, you want to invest stuff in the future, right? You have to do this. And of course, this is a lot of actually feeling of a lot of Protestants. We're like, well, the church is corrupt. It says, right, you can't do usury, and it says that notorious users should be excommunicated. But here are all these popes who are literally taking out loans from the Medici family, and everybody knows it, and they say it's immoral, and like not doing it like in small amounts, like nationwide levels of like debt acquisition. Like, I mean, this stuff is crazy levels of like massive transfers of loans and interest payments. But it's all hush hush, right? We all just pretend, well, I can't see anything. Also, if you disagree with me, who knows? Maybe you'll wind up dead. Because that happened a lot.
Yes, it did.
Or say if a king just tried to go against this, who knows? Maybe your neighbors might invade you.
So is the argument here?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, is the argument here kind of like usury 400 or 500 years ago is contraception today, in as much as like the statistics on Catholics,
everybody does it.
Everyone does it, right?
We say it's wrong. Everybody does it. We all know it's wrong, right? That like this teaching is wrong. Everybody knows it, and the hierarchy systematically looks the other way, but still holds on to an official statement, and it is causing collapse in the practical life of the church. This isn't the reason, but this is a big motivating factor of the Protestant Catholic split, is that Catholic society was becoming systemically dysfunctional, right? Like, we couldn't just take out loans and like build roads and invest or buy fancy things like build cathedrals, right? We had a huge disconnect from the lived experiences of Catholics on the ground, and just a hierarchy that just refused to have the simple humility and honesty of like, oh yeah, maybe we should like look into whether we're right about this. And it's one of those issues, again, it's not like, oh, should we speak English or like, the Vulgate, or Latin at mass, right? Like, obviously that's an important issue, but like that's not gonna like cause society to like stop functioning.
No.
Now maybe if the church was like, if you're Catholic, you can only speak Latin.
That'd be a problem.
Right? Like maybe right, like maybe that might be like closer to a way to talk. But like this issue around usury really just caused all Catholics to go into one of two categories. One, eventually they leave the church because they're like, this is just untenable. Like we just can't function. And those Catholics also include princes, right? Not just like lay people, right? It includes princes, people who own merchant ships, generals, kings, people who have money and they need to make the world happen. Otherwise, like an enemy army might come in and kill them all because like they're not able to properly finance and run their society, right? Like this is like really deep stuff. So a lot of them, it's like, do you leave or do you stay in the church and like bear like the massive Catholic guilt of like, the church says this, and having to deal with radicals screaming out at your door of saying, you're not Catholic and you're a wicked sinner and you should be burnt to the stake because, you're using, loans to be able to pay for things, right? Or you're making loans, you're a banker. And that was true. Right. A lot of the kind of like radical extremism, in the Catholic Church right after the Middle Ages was these people who were attacking, other Catholics for either accepting loans or making those loans. Right. It's classic attack. Right. The papacy is totally corrupt. Right. They've abandoned the teachings, right, of the Catholic Church. And it's like, this stuff sounds really familiar. Sounds really, really familiar, right? And the reason the church changed is this civilizational-wide transition in like, wow, you know what? Like, we never thought about the world in a world where you could have increasing money supply, where you could have an increasing economic growth sustained over long periods of time. We just never imagined that. So we never thought like, well, how would the moral system of money like address that issue? And unfortunately, this took a long time, and it just ratcheted people's conscience. And some people just kind of bury their heads in the sand, just like la la la, la like whatever. I don't know. Maybe the church teaches that. Maybe it doesn't. I'm not really interested in finding out the details of it, right? Because like I don't want to know the answer, right? And that's very kind of like true to today. So that's just like a little bit of this example too, and it's not just on the usury issue. The church has had changes on its official moral teaching on lots of issues, including slavery, including religious liberty, on abortion, on just war, torture, the death penalty, divorce and remarriage, child marriage, and of course the most important one, which we are addressing, is the usury issue. And it's especially pertinent because a lot of people will say, well, a lot of those changes were like, well, we said those were okay, but now we say they're not, right? So it's that kind of like negative, right? Like Peter's keys can bind, right? But like none of those are like loosening, right? Those aren't good examples of loosening. The usury is a loosening, right? It says this is clearly immoral. This is, if you believe in this, you should be treated as a heretic. Interesting enough, they don't say that you are a heretic. This is again part of like this, why it's not infallible teaching. But it's like you should be treated as if you're a heretic, which is bad.
Yes.
Like eternal damnation, fire, hell.
I just did a whole video on how heretics and apostates were treated historically. So they were not treated kindly.
We used to have a sacramental of practice where we would use the material world to help reflect the fires to come in the next world that the heretics would be entering through.
Yes.
If you get my drift.
I sure do. Yep.
But again, that's even a change. Like that's a radical transformation, a total reversal on the church teaching. Right, the church councils from the Middle Ages are very clear that heretics and schismatics and apostates deserve the death penalty. And Vatican II changed all of that, totally inverse, where now the freedom to be able to follow your conscience is a matter of human dignity, right? But again, that's that kind of like, well, we said that was bad, but like, it's okay now. Right. And again, it's like, these are things where like, these aren't these aren't like controversial things. Right. But when you talk to the experience of Catholics, right, like we are constantly bombarded by every second of the day that, well, none of these, right? These are unchangeable. The church has never changed its teaching on slavery. You can go Google it, right? And like 80-90% of the articles are going to tell you, yeah, the church never changed its teaching on slavery. It did.
I have a whole video on the church on slavery as well, and
I did. Yeah, I watched that one of yours.
It's like tough. It's tough to say the church didn't change it.
It's not maybe. It's duh.
Yeah.
And I quoted for you the Catechism, where it clearly says that all forms of slavery are wrong. And of course, like that's a change of thinking. And here's the thing, like this is the eternal sin of Catholics. Like we are so prideful, right? It's the sin of Judah. It's the sin of St. Peter, right? Like we're the biggest and the best. We're the smartest and the most powerful. And so we never have to apologize, and we never have to listen to anyone, and we never have to be humble, and we're never wrong. And like, this is a sin that we constantly commit all the time. And it's like, like it is, there's many times in the church history where, the grace of God and it is the grace of God, because it's not the grace of men. It's not human beings who have gotten through the crises of the church. Because like even to today, like, you know, when the church is finally able to get through this transitional process, like it's not going to be because like, wow, you know what, like Catholic popes and priests, they're just like so holy and humble and wise, and they've like led the Catholic people through. I'm like, no, if it was up to them, we would all turn into trads because it suits their ego. It suits their ego, and the rest because like, you know, like it, and I think like a lot of people like don't have good analogies in this life where they're like, you know, how can you be a part of a society that is like so not willing to be like, hey, I'm sorry, we were wrong.
Yeah.
Like, are bad. Like, just that's it. And you know, this is a problem with the church. You know, that we have a really hard time doing that. The best example is probably just being American, right? Americans have an enormously difficult time of saying like, "Yo, we're sorry. That was that was bad. Our bad." You know, like it's just really hard for us. And you know, the reality is that like, you know, God is going to judge Catholics to a standard far above that he judges anybody else. You know, it's just like in the Gospels, right? Where who are the ultimate most guilty people in Jesus's time? It's the Pharisees, it's the scribes. They are what? Like they know the law, they learn the law, right? They are the most fervent practitioners of the law and they have the authority. And yet they are the ones who have kept the Israel and the Jewish people so reprehensible of a community that the world just looks at them with scorn and hatred and won't accept their message, right? And Jesus has to come and he has to point out that it is them, as Jesus says in the gospel, right? When he goes out and to preach, and if they reject the gospel, right, that their day will be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah, right? This is something that we also have to take seriously. Like if you are a person who lives a life in the church, you don't have a get out of jail free card. You have to pay for every cent card. That's what it means to be the chosen people, is that you have to pay for every single thing because we know better and we have the graces to fix ourselves and we still don't do what God wants us to do, right? And I think that that's a transition that like, you know, it's going to take Jesus to get us through to our head to this because like it's never going to happen by the methods of men. Like God is going to have to do his work. And sometimes he will. And you know what, like, and God every time does this, he chastises the church really brutally, right? And we are going through a brutal chastisement right now. We have Christendom is a non-existent category, right? Catholics are a laughing stock throughout the whole world. And even if you don't care about those things, right? What you should care is that, you know, in the Western world, over 80% of Catholics don't go to church on a weekly basis. You look through the history of the church, and this is one of maybe 3 or 4 times of the greatest calamities and struggles in the church, just like what John Paul I said. This is the greatest theological issue that the church has to contend with because this is such a big deal. And like, we don't want to talk about it, but like, we have to talk about it because if we don't talk about it, there will be no Catholic Church. There won't be.
To some extent, look at me.
There won't be. So, let's also kind of go through, you know, also some other questions on this. And I think this is a good context of people to like realize. So we did about 10 years ago, we did a survey of over like 10,000 individuals where we identified that worldwide, and that doesn't just include the West, right? This includes sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, is that 80% of Catholics reject this teaching. 80% of Catholics worldwide reject the teaching on contraception.
Sounds about right.
This isn't oh, Thomas is some crazy liberal and he wants, gays making out, in tuxedos getting married on the altar, right? Or whatever, paranoid, bigoted fantasy that you have that you think about, right? And it's like, no, this is everybody. Right? This is everybody. And in the United States, right? 92%. And again, these aren't atheists, they're not agnostics who, people have left. These are Catholics. And in the United States, it's 92% of Catholics affirm that contraceptive usage is morally acceptable. Even less say that it's not acceptable. And by the way, 88% of conservative Catholics say that the usage of contraception is morally acceptable in the United States. That is not a trivial number.
What's a conservative Catholic here, though? What's a conservative Catholic with regard to 88% of conservative Catholics in the United States?
So in the poll, it's self-identified. The poll asks you, do you consider yourself liberal or conservative?
That surprises me.
If you identify as conservative, you have an 88% chance that you also say that the use of contraception is morally acceptable.
That surprises me.
It doesn't. Go to any parish.
I grew up abnormally, so
I know.
So that might be why it surprises me.
This is why trads exist, because they go to your normal Novus Ordo church, and like there's maybe one family that has maybe 4 kids. How do you think that's happening, folks?
Right.
Biology 101.
They're not all being celibate all the time.
They're not doing NFP, folks.
Mm-mm.
And by the way, we actually have the statistics for that.
NFP doesn't work.
So in the United States, and again, these are Catholics, 98% of women who are sexually active and are trying to prevent pregnancy don't use NFP. That's 2%. 2% that do use it.
And it's a full 25% of women using NFP to avoid getting pregnant will get pregnant within 12 months. 25%. That is an abysmal rate. That is awful.
Well, how do you think I'm the oldest of 8?
Yep, there you go. I think that that's quite a normal story at my chapel growing up. I'm only one of 4. I don't know how. I try not to think about it, but it was quite normal. My cousins who lived a mile down the road from me, there were 7 of them. There were plenty of families at my chapel with 10 plus kids. So.
Well, and the thing is, like, prior to the demographic transition, right, that started with the Industrial Revolution and the development of sanitation, which decreased death rates, and the whole process that we're going through. But prior to the transition, the average fertility rate of women who had children were 8.
Average?
Per 1,000. Yeah, that's average.
Wow.
So obviously some had 4, but also some had 12.
Yeah.
And that was normal.
Jeez.
That was normal. Right? And this is the kind of thing that we are so removed from the demographic transition that it's hard for us to even imagine a world that was not like this. Right? I mean, it's almost inconceivable. And again, this is an argument of this is why it's so huge. And again, even people who want to really say, maybe it's not the whole church. I'm like, it's 80% who reject this teaching, It's a lot. And by the way, even in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Over 50% of women use artificial contraceptives. And we know that rate would be higher if they had access to contraception. We actually have specific polls stating It's well over 50% if they had access. But reality is, like, I lived in Tanzania, right, for a whole year. People are unimaginably poor there, right? It is really hard for people to wrap their heads around of what it's like to earn $1 to $2 a day and raise a family on that. Like, that's really hard for us to conceptualize. And it is possible because it's the state for almost about 1 to 2 billion people on Earth.
Right.
Like,
There's a billion people just
you
in
know,
China.
like,
You know, I mean, there's another billion in India.
yeah. And so this thing again, the transition is happening in the rest of the world. It's not just the West. And that's what I want to say. And it's like, this transition is inevitable, right? And like, well, we can't have on average 6, 8, 10, 12 kids, whatever it is, right? Because it's immoral. And I want to break. Yeah, yeah.
Do
As
it.
Pope
Let's
Francis said, right?
let's go.
Catholics aren't supposed to be rabbits, right? And this is something that, like, I think a lot of people believe that, like, well, if we just abandon the teaching on contraception, we're giving into licentiousness, immorality, laziness, lack of moral accountability. I would make the argument that contraceptives have given every single man and woman the moral obligation to be able to choose when and where to bring life into the world, which is the most important act that any human being will do, is to create another soul. You will be ultimately responsible if you do that wrong. And this is something that, like, God has given us, of saying this is a time and place where you need to exercise this, right? We don't think that God would look the other way, as if, we use nuclear weapons as a primary means to conduct warfare. And like, well, we want to, like, and if we destroy the entire planet, and send us all back to the Stone Age, that's fine, because, like, we I don't know, we just believe that, like, it was okay to use them, right? Like, we have real moral obligations to the souls that we bring into this world. And contraception, and I think this is part of why people are so uncomfortable with contraceptives, is because they realize, like, oh, I am responsible. I can't just blame it on, well, God wanted us to have another one, like, as if it is some sort of natural phenomena that happens, like the weather.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so that's, I think, is also important. The other thing too is, like, a big issue that we have is that, when we look at the question about, is contraception morally acceptable or not, we often use, like, a lot of people say, like, talk about the issues of theology of the body, right? This is something we bring up, right? And this kind of connects to the theological argument for this issue.
I have questions teed up for you, and I have some questions about this. You
Yeah.
might be anticipating them, so go right ahead.
Yeah. So, first and foremost, if you examine only the body of the male, I'm going to be totally honest, it's actually really hard to think that the unitive and the procreative aspect of sex are and can or should be separated. It's kind of hard. But mankind isn't men. I know, right? God created them male and female. I know. We got to talk about women, right? And the reality is that the female body has been teaching us this whole time that the unitive and the procreative end of sex should be separate, and that they have separate purposes, and that not every instance should be an fulfillment of those ends. And by the way, we also don't, you kind of brought up the teleological argument, like, well, we don't make this argument with anything else. We actually do make this argument with almost everything. What we don't do is to say that, like, in order to achieve these ends, every single instance must have this. So, for example, if I have a business, right, is it immoral for me to go out and like get a loan to like I don't know, like buy some vehicles or some equipment so I can go and like, construct houses or something? Well, if we use that same form of moral logic, the answer would be yes, it would be wrong. Because like the purpose of economic activity is to create profit, to be fruitful. And here I just lost a bunch of money in this act of going out and purchasing or getting debt, right, to be able to do all of this. But of course that's we don't think that way because, right, yes, sometimes a certain act might not specifically fulfill the final end because like we can plan, right? We can plan into the future. Like God gave us a soul and an intellect to be like, hey, don't be like the animals who don't think about the future and plan to the ultimate end. Do that. That's what makes us human, right? And so, yes, I am going to make a big investment. I'm going to lose a lot of money, and trying to start a business. And by the way, I also might fail at my business. I don't know if you know this, but most businesses fail, right? There's a good chance I'm going to spend all this money and time, and the fruitfulness of that is going to be like super negative. And yet we see that as a virtue to like do that because like man's supposed to be productive, right? Like this is an end of economic activity, is to create profits, to make fruit, right? And so this is something that like we take that in all other moral circumstances, but we don't take it in sex and sexuality. Somehow we suspend all these laws. And by the way, we used to do this with money. We used to believe that money, right, was a sterile thing, right? And to, force it to be like making money from money was unnatural, right? And it separated the end of money, which is, to be able to buy and purchase goods, not to be able to make profit. And so the usage of money was seen as like a contraception of economic activity, right? Like I want the benefits of economic growth, but I don't want to have to actually go out and work. I just want to be able to loan, and then I create money, and then I get it for myself. And so it's that I'm just going to get all of the goods of the act of economic activity without having to add anything. It's the same kind of argument we used to make about usury. The same thing too with this kind of naturalistic thing. That's another thing of like, well, we can only use artificial versus non-artificial contraceptives. This is just a naturalistic fallacy.
Yes.
And I think we just need to be really honest about this.
Yes.
Right. And I'll give you an example, right? Like, I'm supposed to achieve the end of my health of my body, right? Like, let's say like healthcare, right? I get vaccines, right?
I take steroids to breathe. I'm asthmatic.
I get a vaccine not because I'm sick. I'm not healing anything that's wrong with me, right? Because someone would say, well, it's okay to heal what's broken. I'm like, well, when I get a vaccine, I'm not healing anything that's broken. I'm not sick. By the way, if you have polio and you get the polio vaccine, it's not going to help. You have to do it beforehand, right? Like that's kind of the whole point, right? And so, and it's the same thing with like, like the teleological end of, let's say, like, the digestive system, right? Are we to say that like, eating artificial sweeteners is a violation?
That's my go-to example. That's my go-to example is diet soda. Yep.
Diet soda is not an abomination, intrinsically evil.
Right.
Because we don't apply this form of thinking to any other moral category.
No, we do not.
We just don't. And and this is something that we just need to be like honest. And it's not that complex. By the way, this is why like the issue around contraception, like it's not just like, oh, super nerdy people like Thomas, have figured out that this is ridiculous. It's like 98% of women are using contraceptives. They figured it all on their own because they have a conscience. This stuff is just like, duh. It's so duh, right? But yeah, let's kind of get back to like, the female body, right? And like this separation of the unitive and procreative, components, right? So have you ever heard of concealed ovulation? Have you ever heard of this term?
No,
Hold on,
partially.
keep talking.
Sure. I haven't heard of concealed ovulation, and that part of that might be because I never took a sex ed class because I wasn't allowed to take a sex ed class. And now I'm married. So
Yeah, because remember I was talking about that systematic ignorance,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Why would you educate a person to be able to make their own informed decisions or even just like know about their body, right?
Yeah, in the past I've called this, and this perhaps is uncharitable, but I've said that there's like a culture of like anti-intellectualness sometimes within certain church circles where it's like they don't want you to be able to make informed decisions. It's just nope, this is what the church teaching is, accept it and move on.
So obviously in trads, like it's just so systemic and prevalent, like it almost boggles the mind.
Mhm.
Um, the anti-intellectualism is pervasive beyond imagining. And by the way, that applies to theology, right? They're anti-intellectual about theology. This is why none of the great theologians are trads. This is why you go to any university, there are no trad, theological professors. This is why during Vatican II, all of the bishops, 98% of them weren't traddy because it's theologically untenable. And we figured this out 150 years ago. And the only way that you can hold to some of those ideas is to be anti theology, to ignore the teachings and the theology of the church, right? And just promulgate, like, well, this is kind of like how I feel. You know what I mean? Like, I got really good vibes that if you receive the Eucharist on the hand, that's probably a mortal sin. Probably. Probably should go to confession for that. It's just deeply anti theology. But in more mainstream areas, right? Like the anti intellectualism is a very specific kind, right? So it's really primarily a pre Enlightenment anti intellectualism, right? Because the church is very pro science, it's very pro theology, but in very restrained ways of communicating and talking about this stuff, right? So this is why we have Catholic universities, right? But every single major Catholic university, except for the abysmally failed ones like Franciscan University of Steubenville, is deeply dysfunctional, not serious, and only has like 3,000-ish people who go. Like
Really?
that's the right. Like that's the best we can. Like that's the best institution we can build. I'm like no. So in order to be able to achieve that, right? Like you had the Land of Lakes statement, where all the Catholic, well, the English-speaking world, all the universities who signed on to that said that we're going to remove the authority of the bishops from being able to choose or remove faculty. And and so this is why you have Notre Dame, which is in the top, 20 universities in the United States, because like the bishop doesn't have any authority over the university because the hierarchy can't manage an intellectual institution. They are radically untrustworthy. They're radically untrustworthy. And like that's a failure of like the hierarchy of being able to accept like of how to manage and live out academic freedom. So the way we do intellectualism is, outside of the authority control of the church, and then basically the hierarchy just pretends none of it happens and we don't talk about it. Right? We'll let the crazy monk scientist people do their woohoo, in their like classrooms or whatever, but like don't bring it in church.
It's so funny. I say a
Which,
lot of
by the
these
way,
things too.
that's how they did it in the French monarchy.
Yeah.
The monarch was like, "Yeah, dude, I don't care what kind of enlightenment woohoo stuff you do in the university."
Okay, I
Sure.
need to ask you a question,
Yeah.
and I've been holding on to all these questions because you were on such a flow, and I just didn't want to interrupt you. But we've got a bunch, so if you don't mind, maybe we can go into
Yeah.
like a Q&A kind of section. First,
Yeah, we can get some of the Q&A
okay,
going.
first viewer is gonna be from me. So why? Because it's my channel, and I said so. So
But reason.
you've raised a bunch of the points that were kind of the first points that occurred to me during my deconstruction. That ultimately
Okay.
led me out of the church, frankly.
Yep.
And it didn't for you. Um, Perhaps part of that is that I was raised like FSSP trad. So like when I
Dude,
found
you got,
out,
I'm sorry, like you got, I mean, well, as we put it, like you're a part of a cult, dude. Like,
I
no questions about it.
I
Like,
refer to it as a cult when I'm being like
I know
flippant.
you get a little iffy about it, but like, I'll
Yeah.
say it for you. I'll say it for you. Like, the traditional movement is a cult, right? And the way we receive faith and have trust, right, in the teaching is through tradition, right? And tradition requires you to have faith in those who pass it on to you and for you to trust those people. When the people who passed on the faith to you are untrustworthy, which yours were, it is right for you to reject what it is they gave you.
Yeah. And my rejection kind of looked like this. Okay, so they painted me this picture, and I found this picture just to be wildly inaccurate. Like the
As it is.
yeah, the infallibility of the church and all this. I was like, none of this is right. And so I think that I just saw enough things that were not the way that I thought they were that I kind of said, I don't want anything. I don't, you know, I saw enough things that are wrong that I'm like, okay, I don't think I can call
You're done.
myself what I was before. Like whatever I am now, it's not the same as what I was before. Um, you though, you haven't done that. So maybe in that sense, while I've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, you haven't. So, but I guess my question for you is something like this: like how haven't you thrown the baby out with the bathwater? Like
Yeah.
how do you still call yourself Catholic? After having kind of like these disagreements with what the church claims herself to be, I guess.
So I'm gonna give two answers. Number one, this is the number one fun. This is the real reason people leave. This is the real reason people drift
I think
away,
so.
whether they say it or not. Right? You can do surveys. People usually people will answer the question of not directly. They'll answer them like, "Well, the church is bigoted towards gay people," or the sexual abuse and scandals in the Catholic Church. And the problem is like the statistics don't bear that out, right? That this is why people are leaving. The reason people are leaving is because of the sexual teachings themselves. And I'll give it like a really good example, right? Uh, so I think this is really important. So in 1955 to 1965, so that's from before the council up to the council. Um, about 75% of young people went to mass daily, or not daily, weekly. Weekly, 75%. It was very high. By the way, all age groups are super high. It was all, mid 70s, 80%, right? Like it was just normal. And by the way, because that's how it's always been. Catholics always go to church on Sunday. Like Protestants, like that used to be a cultural difference between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants, like, when I feel like it. But like Catholics were always went to church, right? Because the church said you have to go. And they're like, okay, well, I'm gonna go. Um, but from that time period, from 1955 to 1965, by the way, this is before Humanae Vitae and right after the end of Vatican II. 20% of young Catholics from like 18 to 30 stopped going to church every Sunday. And we know why. We have surveys, right? We went and we look at surveys from 1965, and we did polls. And again, this is before Humanae Vitae. This is after the completion of Vatican II, right? And again, for all those trads who thought, Vatican II was the cause, like this collapse happened before and up to the very end of Vatican II. This isn't a product from afterwards, right? This collapse happened previously. And they asked the question about this is like Americans in 1965, back when we just decided black people should have equal rights, when women didn't have a legal right to contraceptives or be able to have a right to have a credit card. Like, we're not talking about, the super hippie liberal folks, this is your 60s, guys. This is the golden age.
The Beatles were still singing about wanting to hold your hand, right? That was the scandalous thing, was that the Beatles wanted to hold your hand.
And yet, of Catholics, 56% of them believed that the church was going to change its teaching on contraception. Wow. 56% of them believed it in 1965. And in 1965, 52% of them thought that the church should change its teaching. The young people thought Vatican II was going to change this teaching. It didn't happen. In fact, not only did it not happen,
it doubled down.
Well, at Vatican II, it did not double down. It just never mentioned it.
Okay.
Humanae Vitae was the doubling down.
What year was Humanae Vitae? Was that not...
1968. 3 years later.
Oh, okay. I have my timeline screwed up.
It's kind of like, historically, they're very close.
Yeah.
But it's in 1968. Which would, by the way, right, during that, time period, right? Paul VI got together the experts of theologians of around the Catholic world to inquire on this issue, whether or not the church could or should change the teaching. And the supermajority of that committee that he handpicked said, yeah,
that's right.
The church should change.
But the Pope just kind of said no, right? Like,
yep.
Yeah,
and
I remember
so the Pope was like, thanks for the advice, but
no thanks.
No.
Yeah, that's right.
So we now fast forward to our surveys from 1965 to 1975. What happened in that time period? Humanae Vitae and Roe. And we saw this is the next massive collapse. Another 20% of young Catholics stopped going to church. And that was virtually like half of young Catholics were just like, yeah, we're not going to go to Sunday. Because as Paul I said, this issue addresses all young families. This isn't just one more issue. This means of like whether or not I can like date or like pursue marriage and how I do courtship. Can I go to work in a co-ed environment? And like, how am I going to be able to plan for my family, my financial future, right? Like, these are really deep stuff, folks. Like, can I live in an urban environment where I don't have chaperones, right? Like, this is big deal. And the young people left first because I think it impacted them immediately. They got just disillusioned. Like, I don't even know. I can't do it. Some of the older people, I think, were like, hey, wait, we know the church, like, we're Catholic. We know the church is going to change this teaching, right? Like, it'll just give it a little bit of time. But after Humanae Vitae, yeah, that's when the collapse of all the older folks just descended multiple double digits. And we've never seen such a massive downward, just immediate drop in church attendance ever since. What we have seen is the slow, perpetual trickle down, 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 down. Because what happens is those initial people are like, what the hell? Like, I'm still Catholic, but like, I can't participate in Catholic life. Right? And slowly that answer just eventually people can't handle it anymore. Right? Like, you know what? I really love the church. I really love Catholicism. I think it's true, but like I can't keep going to the parish and like keep doing this where like the sex issue and like, you know, always just wears away of like can I keep going and be like, yeah, Father, forgive me, for, I sinned, and then just not mention the contraceptive issue? Or maybe you do and you're like, but I don't really believe it. And then like everybody has their own journey, right? But like eventually this issue just wears away at people and people just fade away from active participation in the church. And that includes not just mass, it includes sending their kids to Catholic schools, sending their kids or like working, or sending, people to Catholic hospitals, of running Catholic charities, right? Of being active in politics, right? Like, because again, it just wears away that like, and I know this because I tried really, really, really hard. I spent so much time in the institutional church, and I've spent so much. And this is what I found is that like there are so many problems is that you keep running into the sex issue that it makes it so that just like living Catholic, like you either have to kind of like be willing and able, and depending on where you are, maybe you can like just like kind of just like pretend it's not an issue, kind of bury your head in the sand. But like eventually some people are just like, I just can't stand. I can't feel the guilt of like going to church with only two kids, and I'm like 45. Like I know what everybody sees, and I don't know if I can't keep doing this anymore. Like I feel like a liar and a hypocrite. Like I'll go on Christmas and like Easter, like I can handle it. It's like it's like right. It's like being in a dysfunctional family, right? Like I don't want to leave my family, but like I can't be over like eating dinner every week, Mom, because you're nuts, right? Like I can see you like once or twice a year, and that's the amount that I can handle. I love you, but like you got to get your shit together. Like come on. And like this is where most Catholics are. So, ask me of like, how can I hold it? Like I'm in the category of like most Catholics, like, uh we believe, but we also see that just on a practicing every weekly basis, like it's not possible for most people.
Yeah. Yeah. One more question for me, and then I'd love to get to some audience questions if that's all right. Um,
Yeah.
and that is just okay. So when I was kind of going through the whole deconstruction process, it occurred to me. So not only did I just not think that contraception was actually immoral, I straight up didn't think that morality was teleological in nature. Like when I thought about it, I was like, I don't think it's actually wrong to frustrate any of the ends of a thing. So I didn't think that contraception was wrong. Why? Because I didn't think that it was wrong to frustrate the procreative telos of the procreative
Yeah.
act. I also didn't think that it was wrong to drink diet soda, even though that frustrates the telos of the stomach, right? Because you're not absorbing any nutrients. I didn't find it wrong to cauterize your toenails if you're a long distance runner, right? Even though that's frustrating the telos of your toenails to
Yeah.
grow. Like
Right.
so I saw all these things and I thought to myself, whatever morality is, I just don't think that it is teleological. Um,
Yeah.
and I don't think you've gone as far as I did. I think that you might kind of say like, no, I do think the morality is teleological. It's just
I
that,
do.
yeah, and it's just that it's not wrong. Like maybe it's wrong to frustrate all of the teloi of something, but it's not
Yes.
wrong to frustrate one of them as long as you're fulfilling another, right? Maybe that's your view. Um, Flesh that out for
Yeah,
me.
I would also specify, right? Like I also don't believe, right, the first commandment that God gave us, right, is to be fruitful and to multiply.
Uh-oh, might have lost Thomas again real
This
quick.
isn't
Oop.
like an optional command. Yeah, I see a little. How are we doing? Let
Okay,
me know if you can hear me.
I
Are we
can.
back?
Yeah, you're back. Just restart. You
Yeah.
said be fruitful and multiply.
The first commandment that God gives us is to be fruitful and to multiply. This isn't some like kind of abstract command, right? Like this is at the core of our moral obligations to mankind and to God, is to be fruitful and to multiply. But here's the thing, that moral obligation isn't the burden of the individual.
It's the burden of the collective.
Of society.
Yeah.
And if you don't agree with me, then Jesus was one of the greatest sinners because he systematically refused to have children.
St. Paul?
Which is just like, come on, we're Catholics. We know better than this.
Right.
But Catholics still will say stuff like that. Like, well, in order for you to be a good person, like you have to have kids. Like you're a bad person if you don't have kids. And I'm like, we have brothers and sisters, priests who are celibate. Jesus was celibate. Like, yes, as an individual, you don't have an obligation to fulfill the procreation, but this is so important to who we are because, being is the most important moral question. Non-being is always infinitely worse than being. And if we live a life where there ceases to be humanity, like that's the worst evil, right? That's a suicide of the whole species. Like, that's really bad, right? So, like, we do have to take this very seriously, but the idea that like every individual, and it's the same thing with like economic productivity, right? Like, every individual doesn't have a moral obligation, right, to be economically productive. Otherwise, I mean, you slide into like Nazi, like, let's get rid of the crippled people because they're not feeling their moral teleos, which is definitely not Christian. Like, really not Christian. Like, God himself loves the poor and the disabled, the widows, the misfortune. And it is an abomination that cries out to heaven when we attack them. But that doesn't change the fact that the responsibility of society is to be productive. We are to till the earth and to keep it. That's our job here, folks. So this, I think, is where I think a lot of people who reject teleology, like the first one is like the version they got was just obviously dumb.
I don't disagree.
Which doesn't mean that I'm right on the teleos thing, but like I just found an experience in like a lot of people who argue, for it, like their version of it is just like, dude, come get out of here.
Yeah.
This isn't even serious.
Cool. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to go through some audience questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
First two are not questions. I just want to say that Daniel said he was taking notes. Anton said that he's getting to appreciate how much history informs your perspective. So you've got
some Catholic.
There you go.
Tradition.
Yeah, you've got some fans in the audience who are just complimenting your.
But thank you, Anton.
So, couple questions though. One comes from Based Thomist, who I assume by his username is a very liberal Catholic. Obviously, I joke. But Based Thomist has this question. So, the condemnation of artificial methods of birth control in Humanae Vitae fulfills the three essential criteria set forth in Vatican I. And so this was while we were talking about how you were saying that not only is Humanae Vitae not infallible, but it's like uncontroversially not infallible because literally all of the popes have said that it's not. And so Based Thomist here says that, but it meets all the three criteria set forth in Vatican I. So take as much time as you want on this one. What do you think about this?
So yeah, I'll just like reiterate. Every single pope has said it's not infallible and has affirmed that. So in order to hold to that position, right, like we have to say that, the man who wrote it was wrong. The man who succeeded him and is a blessed and in heaven and was the pope, not just one, not just two, not just three, but 4 ones afterward, have every single one of them affirmed that it is not an infallible teaching. And probably like this is the thing is that like this is where the creeping infallibility heresy is just destroying the Catholic Church. We just make things up that are infallible, and we do not follow the strict theology and the teaching of the Church, as outlined first by Vatican I and then clarified by Vatican II. And an example of Vatican II, this is why I brought up the Winnipeg, statement that the first one is that like it's not in union with all the bishops, right? an entire all the Canadian bishops immediately rejected Humanae Vitae right out the gate. So it's not a universal teaching in communion with all of the bishops. And then yeah, like also just like Paul VI said it wasn't, and like he's the Pope who wrote it. I Part of it's like that has nothing to do with like theology. That has to do with like, do you like believe in the church at all? Like, do you think we have a pope? Do you think we have a Catholic Church, or is it just like some like dusty stuff? And of course, this is where the trads get. They're like, well, yeah, that's why we like you shouldn't follow Paul VI because he's one of those post Vatican II popes. And I'm like, okay, well then you're following a different religion, right? You're falling into heresy when you say that like we can't trust or follow the teachings of the popes.
What I'll add here too is that I've referred to the infallibility of the Catholic Church as a shell game, or like a shell corporation,
Shell
where
game by unscrupulous Rosament priests and bishops, because like the reality is they know what the teaching of the church. And when you read John the Paul's statements that are just so solemn, like he very carefully words them to make sure that they're not extraordinarily defined. He's very well aware of this, right? And it's the same thing with every other issue, right? It's like they intentionally and systematically obscured the teaching of the church's teaching on infallibility, and tried to make everything infallible. And I would argue it's like this is ultimately the sin of blasphemy, because what it does is that it takes what is profane and elevates it to the sacred, right? When you put the wild cattle who've trampled through their own feces and you let them walk in through the temple, right? It's profane because you're saying, this belongs here. And ultimately what happens is that the dogmas of the church are, as Catholics, what we must be willing to stake our immortal souls on, to die for, right? To have that zeal, that faith that the early Christians had of saying, like, you're going to have to burn me alive, and even that won't get me to reject that. And when we confuse that with, like, hey, these are very informed, very serious theological opinions of the church, it creates the mess we're in, where we pretend that the teachings of men are the teachings of God, which is the very sin that the Pharisees committed that Jesus so repeatedly called out.
yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add there besides my whole perspective on the infallibility of the Catholic Church is that it's so ill defined that there's almost no point.
So ill communicated. I think that's the important. It's so ill communicated, and that's on purpose.
It is on purpose. It's 100% on purpose. Okay, next one. This one comes from my friend Nugloff, who I'm actually having on the show tomorrow. And this comes from the part where we were talking about. So your whole point, I believe, if I can put words in your mouth for a moment, was we have a responsibility to become as educated as we can be on these topics and then follow our conscience, even if the society that we're in is telling us that it is a sin to use contraception. Like, if you honestly don't think it is and you've done your homework, then guess what, it's actually not wrong for you. I think that was your point. And so I think Gloff's question is, well, define a well-formed conscience. And if I may, I know Gloff, so I think I know where his head was at with this. I think his point is something to the effect of your conscience needs to be formed by the traditional teaching of the church, and if the traditional teaching has been, at least
if you're Catholic.
Yeah, I think that's his point.
Because that's the thing. Like, so first and foremost, like, what do we have binding on our conscience, right? Like, if you're not Catholic, right? Catholic teaching isn't binding on your conscience. God is not going to judge you for, whether or not you followed the church and what it taught, right? Um, and so the reality is like we all need well-informed conscience. And like this isn't even kind of like a Catholic thing. This is just like this is a human thing. Like, you know, you have to know what's right and wrong. And just like in a court, right? Like, I mean, if I say, well, Your Honor, I didn't know that murdering my sister and chopping off her head and cutting her to pieces and then turning her to fertilizer, I didn't know that was wrong or against the law. So like, you should like let me off.
I don't think that would work.
That doesn't fly. That doesn't fly. But here's the thing, like if there's some obscure accounting law, right, about like I don't know a deduction or whatever, and like everything else like in my taxes seemed to be lined up, but there was just kind of one thing that was off. Like, yeah, I can like plead ignorance. Like look, I didn't good. Or by the way, like this is what we do. Like whenever a police officer pulls you over and like, if you're it's like, hey, like how fast are you going? I'm like, well, I don't know. And look, some of y'all are lying, okay, which is a sin, but maybe the officer doesn't need to know it, so it's okay. But that is a real answer, right? A real answer is like, yeah, I didn't know, but there is negligence, right, and willful ignorance, and like this issue, like on the infallibility thing, right? Like that Base Thomas brought up, like I would make the strong argument that and most trads and other, even conservative Catholics will say like, no, it is definitely 100% infallible. Most of those people believe that because of ignorance, but a lot of them actually look into it and take seriously, and they come up with a different answer because they're willfully ignorant. And that's a sin, and that's how we are with anything. And when it comes to the teaching of the church, right? Like, yeah, like you can't just say, hey, you know what? Like, I just don't like, I don't know, the prohibition against the death penalty. I think it's lame. Like, I think the death penalty is morally acceptable, and I don't have to inquire as to why. Like, that's not a well-informed conscience, right? Well-informed conscience does take seriously. And by the way, like, there are very serious people who really look into this and like they really genuinely disagree, and I think that's like super valid. That like, hey, you know what, like it just doesn't make sense that like the state can never put someone to death. Maybe we can make an argument where maybe it's prudential to do or not to do, but like um that's a well-informed conscience. And it also part of it too is like living out, and I think that's maybe I don't want to like over intellectualize, right? It's not just an intellectual experience, right? Because like conscience isn't just something that we think of the mind and we can like I don't know, I identify these ideal forms of reason and all this gobbledygook. Um, I know the realists will disagree with me, but you guys are like you're seeing things in the clouds, like you have to go and live out the experience, and you got to touch grass, you know and the moral life is the same way. Like, how do we learn to be nice to kids? Like, well, you go and play with the kids in the playground, right? Like, that's what you have to learn, this process of being moral. So I don't know.
You touch grass. I like it. Here's another one from Based Thomist, and he says that the Lamborghini opinion from that statement was removed from the official account of the press conference. It appeared in, that must be some kind of publication, the next day removed. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so his comment wasn't published, but it was recorded during the time. And you can say whatever you want from that. But here's the thing. Everybody knew it. Everybody heard it. And there were millions of Catholics who disagreed on this issue. The congregation of the Canadian bishops themselves issued a letter 2 months later rejecting Humanae Vitae. Paul VI never made a single correction to state that, no, yes, it really is infallible. And by the way, when you read it, it's pretty obvious that it's not infallible. Like, it just It's just not infallible.
Yeah.
And again, that's why, like, Benedict himself thought it wasn't infallible, you know? So, if you need a conservative theologian to confirm that, like, I mean, he's kind of like the guy.
I think so. Question from Anton for you. Given the complex history of changes in church teaching, does Thomas think that the lines between venial and mortal sins can be reconsidered with regard to sexual matters? And I think Anton is almost certainly referring to very commonly repeated things, at least in trad circles, about how like all sins regarding the sixth commandment are always mortal no matter what.
Am I still here?
Yeah, I
Oh,
can
wait, a
hear you.
little.
You're a little herky jerky, but now you look
Okay.
good.
So I would say that, you know, the church shouldn't ever change its teaching on venial and mortal sin distinction. And look, I think that the church is 1,000% right on this. And it's something I hold to personally, and I have a lot of reasons why I think that personally. Now, I think is what you're really asking is, because we already went over to like changing, teachings. And by the way, like I think this was something that like should have been done a long time ago. And again, this was just one of those things where we just um point being is that like we'll take an example in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, right? It very clearly outlines explicitly and in particular on the sin of masturbation. Is it makes broad and explicit terms for circumstances where, although it is a grave sin and intrinsically evil, that there are many and broad ranging circumstances where the culpability of the person doing it would mean that it is a venial sin for them, right? And by the way, like that's important that we put that in there because like otherwise like it can drive people absolutely insane with moral guilt and paranoia and fear and terror. I know because like I was one of those people. Like I was taught that like yeah, if you do the deed, by yourself, straight to the fiery pits you go. And it's like that is really abusive and horrible. And we can get to maybe another conversation as to like why we've actually changed our attitudes about that. But you know, we always could have put like those. This is the thing. Like church teaching is very clear, right? Like it takes three things in order for something to be a mortal sin, and then it has to be of a grave matter. You have to do it with full free will, and there has to be the right circumstances that don't mitigate that. And the reality is, like, this is a communication problem. Depending on your theological school, wherever you were, your kind of parish, like, you're either going to have those things communicated clearly or they're going to be intentionally obscured, right? And that comes down to like just human institutional like poor catechesis, right? But yeah, I'm not talking about that. I think that the question on the contraception is that it's just not intrinsically evil,
Yeah, it's
and
not a
it
question of
needs
venial or mortal. It's a question of if it's a sin at all.
and it needs to change.
Yeah. Going back to based Thomist one more time. So there's two back to back that are connected. And the gist of these two comments is nothing has changed with regard to usury. That's what based Thomist's opinion is here. So when
I already addressed that.
You did, I
So
think that
part of this is like I have already addressed these things. I've also heard these comments from 1,000 people just like base Thomas, and it did change. Go look up the canons in Lateran 3 on usury, and go look up the canons on the Council of Nicaea on usury.
um,
And like that's I know like it's really that simple. Do a little bit of homework because that's how you're going to inform your conscience. Otherwise, like I don't really have a point in having that kind of discussion.
I'm not going to be able to find it right now, but there's a really good article written by like a conservative Catholic writer. I forget who it is, but they do a really good job at laying out the usury debacle, for lack of a better term.
Or,
And
by
they
the way,
agree
just
it
look it up on
changed.
Catholic Encyclopedia. Just look up the Catholic Encyclopedia
Yeah.
page, and it'll explain to you how the church changed the teaching on usury. Like, this isn't something like, this is where I get into people, is like people who are around trads or very conservatives, like they've just been lied to all of their lives and taught that, well, like, we're not going to teach you church history, we're not going to teach you church teaching, and we're going to say this is what the church says when that has nothing to do with what the church says. And then when people run into these counter narratives, right, like, it sounds so fantastical, but it's like, yeah, I'm sorry, like, you just need to inform your conscience, and I gave you the resources to have better catechesis.
Yeah.
The rest of it's on your soul, man.
Speaking of resources, Rosemary, a good friend of mine who is a graduate from Franciscan but is no longer Catholic like me, she wants to read more about usury. I know that you just listed the Catholic Encyclopedia as a good resource, and I second that. Do you have any other sources that you recommend for somebody who wants to learn more about usury in the Catholic Church?
So, if you want to do the real deal, right? You want to go into the deep dive, you have to read John Noonan.
John Noonan.
John Noonan is the foremost expert on the teachings and the history of the Catholic Church when it comes to the issues around abortion and contraception. And reading his book, John Noonan, on contraception, and he's going to address the issue about usury in extreme detail. It's exhaustive. It is the academic work on the issue.
Cool. I've got one more for sure that I want to highlight right here, and I'm going to see if there's any others while you respond to this. But even before you respond to this one, if you don't mind, I would like to say a few words. So
yeah.
This one, it says, this is a lot of words to say I don't like chastity. Mr. JPC, all I have to say to you is that you are epitomizing the anti-intellectualness that I was critiquing maybe 20 minutes ago on this very stream.
Yeah.
Your critique of our position
as very few. See, bigots have few words to say.
Yeah.
I'll be more straightforward about it. So thanks, dude.
Yeah, and all that I was going to say here was that I think that this exact attitude of just, oh, you just don't like chastity, that's the y'all just want to sin, but like the Catholic version of it, because like y'all just want to sin is typically like the evangelical kind of Protestant thing. I heard this every day when I was going through my deconstruction process. I was meeting with a trad priest, weekly during like for months when I was coming out of the Catholic Church. And the priest didn't say you just want to sin, but plenty of lay Catholics told me you just want to sin. And this is exactly that exact same attitude. And look where it got me, JPC. I'm not Catholic anymore. This attitude is
that's what it does.
It makes ex-Catholics. I am a cautionary tale to this extent. So JPC, I would just I would warn you from trying to like engender this attitude in more conversations, because I think that you're going to make more Kevins. And I don't know if you want more Kevins. I like me, but not everyone else does. Okay, I've got a few more questions from Risto. So Risto asks, would changing the stance on contraceptions falsify the Catholic claims of infallibility? I think I know
No.
I didn't. Yeah.
Obviously.
Right.
Because the church has never claimed that the teaching on contraceptive is infallible.
And his next question, because I think he was asking it while we were talking about this.
Yeah. Dogmas are infallible. As I you may not have been here earlier, but like, you know, the dogmas of the Catholic Church are require the assent of faith of all Catholics, right? We need to be able to stake our immortal souls and our very lives for the dogmas of the Catholic Church. These are the sacred foundations of what God has given to us with absolute clarity and bindingness. That's what we have to hold to. Authoritative teachings are things that would require religious assent. Those aren't the same thing. And things that require religious assent have changed many times before. Um, and they will certainly change many times again. And that's why the church doesn't, well, declare them infallible. However, there are many unscrupulous people who want to pretend that they're infallible because, well, like JPC, like it's about control, bigotry, and personal gain, and the inability to even have a conversation with faithful, God-fearing Catholics.
Yeah. Um, I've got one more comment that I'm going to highlight. It's not even a question. Wait, first though, a question for you. Noonan. What is his first name?
John.
What's his middle name? Do you know? Because Risto
I think it's
makes
N. I think it's, but I actually don't know. I don't know John Noonan.
Risto says John Henry Noonan. I think it was John
it
Henry
Henry?
Newman, but John
But
Henry
Risto,
Noonan.
you're probably right. You got the search. So,
No,
but yeah,
I think
John
this is a
Noonan.
joke on John Henry Newman, but John Henry
Oh,
Noonan. I think that's just the joke, which I think is funny. But
okay. If that is, I don't know if that is. I'm gonna pretend it is because it's really funny.
that is funny. I think it's a joke based on the wiki base, but I think we made it through all the questions. So Thomas, I might just ask you, can you or is there a note that you want to end on? And if there's nothing in particular that you want to end on, I might just kind of ask you to give like, the 3-sentence summary of our discussion tonight or something like that. So take it away before I take us out.
Yeah. So I would say is that this issue. I want to go back to the words of Blessed John Paul I again. This is the most important theological issue that the church has ever dealt with. It is not the concern of theologians or bishops, but involves all young families. This is the apocalypse that the church is experiencing. That's always something that has, the trads have always gotten right. Like, there is an apocalypse happening in the church. The church is collapsing before our eyes. And it is around this issue, right? And so, like, the problem is that, like, they've tried and it's failed, right? And when it comes to this issue of contraception, I would ask for two things. One, Catholics in America don't accept this teaching. They don't. 92% of Catholics in America reject the Catholic Church's teaching. Yes, I know it's hard to speak out and to be clear and communicate, but like the reality is like the people who are against this are a microscopic tyrannical minority. They do not represent the church. You are the church and you need to speak out. Because if you don't speak out the courage of your moral conscience, then you will end up outside of the church. And if you don't, your children and grandchildren, your neighbors, the people who sit in your pews, the people you love, there won't be a church if we don't speak out with a clear voice, our conscience that God has given you. Speak on this and be courageous. Now is the time. The synodal period of the church is beginning. And that requires us to pick up the burden to go out and speak. Now is the time.
Amen.
Yeah.
Thomas, this was awesome. I learned a ton, and it's given me an appreciation for something that I thought was a lot more black and white. Oh, I mean, frankly, up until 2 hours ago.
Got to talk to more Jesuits.
I do. Hey, I'm on a mission to talk to more Jesuits.
I know Chris Brown and you got like a thing.
Yeah,
I love it.
Yeah. So Thomas, I apologize that I didn't have a link to your Twitter in the description when the stream started. It is there now. So if anybody is on the stream and just hits refresh and wants to follow Thomas at Thomas Polega, something, right? That's your Twitter.
I'm at Thomas Polega.
Perfect. At Thomas Polega. I put the link to your Twitter feed, your Twitter thing. I'm not on Twitter, in the description. So if anybody wants to go follow Thomas, please do. Thomas, thank you again. This was fantastic. And until next time.
Okay. Well, God bless.